First, a bit of housekeeping. If anybody feels the urge, toilet is through that door, and I've just checked it out before. It's fine. It's all good. If there's an earthquake, drop cover and hold, and then when it stops, out that door. If there's a fire, out that door. And I think that concludes housekeeping. I'm Timo Neubauer, a local urban designer, founding member of Nelson Tasman 2050, our very own local think tank of built environment professionals. As such, I am a frequent submitter. I publish a few newspaper articles and sometimes present at council hearings or public talks, such as a few weeks ago together with Magda. I also sometimes frequent social media and get almost as much abuse as the councils do. But don't panic, you're not here to hear me talk today, at least not for long. I'm here to introduce George Weeks. So George holds 3 university degrees, yep, 3. A Master of Arts in Sustainable Urbanism, a Bachelor of Geography and Economics, a Master of Science in City Planning and Real Estate Development. He is a chartered town planner, a fellow urban designer, and as such, he is the living example that you can be both a planner and understand urban design. He is an alumnus of the Princess Foundation for the Built Environment and currently the principal urban designer at Kainga Ora. Previously, he worked for Auckland Council's Urban Design Unit, and he led the fantastic Auckland City Master Plan Refresh. Before that, just to shorten this a little bit, he held all sorts of amazing positions in the UK. So I met George earlier this year at the Urbanism New Zealand conference up in Auckland, you'll be here for his presentation, but he had me in fits of laughter right from the word go. I had tears in my eyes and I was nearly slipping off the chair. So he has a unique way of synthesizing international best practice and to address local requirements and opportunities. So George is a very entertaining speaker at debunking myths about Europe, which is very relevant for unpicking common arguments that I hear too often in our region, why we are so different and why those solutions don't work here. We need more parking, cycleways, waste of time and ratepayers' money. Public transport will never work here. Nelsonians need their standalone houses. Sounds familiar? So when I heard George speak earlier this year, I knew that we had to get him down here to speak to us. And I am thrilled to have you guys in the room. So I hope that George's talk will provide some valuable facts for your considerations at the next elections and maybe when you do your council submissions. Also spread the words, of course, to people that are not here that you know. But before we get started, I want to take this opportunity to thank, firstly, George for pretty much coming down here to see us free of charge. Buffer Mythical and for paying for his air travel, and especially Alan Gray, who arranged all that. And this is where the paper gets stuck. But there's not much left here, so George will take questions at the end of his talk. But you will find you won't get a word in anyway, so please join me to welcome George Weeks.
Thank you everybody, and thank you very much for coming to Whate Whakato Nelson. My name is George Weeks and I'm going to talk about the art of the possible. I have lived in New Zealand for 7 years, but I am European. That is my context. I grew up in Bristol in southwest England, which is famous for Concorde and the Clifton Suspension Bridge, and then I worked for many years as an urban designer at Transport for London. That's me in my work get-up, honest. And then I moved to Auckland Design Office 7 years ago to refresh the city centre master plan and to take up sailing at the weekend. But I mean, as well as sailing, I just really enjoy being able to explore the country on any way possible. I find New Zealand a very explorable country and I do love living here very much. And it's a real treat to be down here in Nelson. And I mean, this obviously is a session to think about ideas, but I'm sure some of you, or some of your relations maybe, are thinking, why is some git from Auckland, who's English, coming to talk to us about urban design? I mean, Nelson has a very, very unique history, the centre of New Zealand's apple production, very different patterns of urban growth to a European city. We're not in Europe. And I agree. So let's fly far away. Let's fly far away to a different continent, to a different country that is a very big country that many of us have been to on holiday or been through. I'm talking about the country that practically invented the car and which makes millions of cars every year. I'm talking about taking us to a country where every city used to have tramways up until the 1930s, and like New Zealand, got rid of all of its trams by the 50s to make way for urban motorway projects, to make space for traffic and make rather a mess of the urban fabric, while displacing people to peripheral public housing projects and developing one of the world's most monumental expressway systems. Hello. And I'm talking about a country that loves to build monuments. I'm talking about a country whose most famous monument is the Statue of Liberty. So by now you've probably realised I'm talking about my favourite country in the world after New Zealand. And that is France. And while our image of urban France is one of elegance and beauty, much of urban France looks much more like this. This could be the Auckland Central motorway junction, but it's the Bungalow interchange on the edge of central Paris. And you can see this scene in almost any European country, like Spain, for instance. This is Bilbao, and this is the Bilbao urban motorway system. Pretty intense scene, isn't it? And while the image that most of us have of Bilbao, if we have one, is of the beautiful Guggenheim Museum, even though for daily life in Bilbao, the metro system, which was built about the same time, is much more useful. Now, my beef is that it is inaccurate to claim that livable cities are inevitably European or somehow in the European DNA. But really, it's amazing the rubbish that people will spout about Europe, typically while propping up the barbecue. So let's go to Europe. Let's go to Europe and learn about some myths. So first things first, it's far too complicated to think of the European continent as 44 separate sovereign states. So let's just make it one country. That's much simpler, isn't it? We will call it the Republic of Europe. And this is our first myth. It's one big homogeneous country. Every city in the Republic of Europe is very, very old, thousands of years old, full of history. In return, I give you Milton Keynes in Buckinghamshire, which is certainly fascinating, but it's definitely not historic. It was founded in the 60s. It's no older than Upper Hutt. And in the Republic of Europe, car parking apparently isn't an issue. I literally heard this quote directly from somebody who ought to know better, saying that in a European capital, they don't need to think about car parking. I mean, this is a painting of Paris in the early 20th century. This is Paris now. Paris is a modern city, and it has modern city problems, and that includes thinking about car parking. And if you want to know what happens in Paris if you try and remove car parking, this is what happens in Paris if you try to remove car parking. So in the Republic of Europe, everyone cycles everywhere for everything because it's all in their European DNA. But really, there is huge variation. In the UK, where I'm from, people cycle about as much as Canadians. The French cycle a bit more. The Dutch cycle by far the most. What's interesting is that Belgium's just next door to the Netherlands. It's very similar geography. Belgians cycle much less. And similarly, in the Republic of Europe, as well as everyone having bicycle-shaped DNA, every car is tiny because every city is old and every European country is always anti-car. And that's rubbish as well, because if you're looking to buy a luxury car that isn't a Tesla, chances are it's German, maybe British if you fancy a Jag. And there's this received wisdom that Europeans don't buy utes for fun like we do in New Zealand. But that's definitely a Ford Raptor pickup, and that's definitely Prague. And statements like this are really untrue and they're unhelpful. We've got some more utes in stupid places. They're really unhelpful because they imply that utes are just deeply embedded in the Kiwi DNA and that Europeans would never do such a thing. And that's rubbish. And so my overall point is that while the sort of Republic of Europe is this very sort of quaint, chocolate boxy little historic enclave, really it's a continent of great diversity with the same problems that the modern world has. So let's not talk about the Republic of Europe anymore because it doesn't exist. First things first. For a start, there are 44 countries in Europe, each with their own languages, and each country has its own history, traditions, folklore, probably monarchies, and even within countries there is endless regional varieties, such as the 246 varieties of cheese in France. And some countries in Europe have very high population densities and some are much lower. New Zealand has quite a lot in common with the Scandinavian countries. They've all got quite low densities. We're slightly denser than Finland and Norway, slightly less dense than Sweden. And similarly, the dark ones, England, Germany, Italy, these are the dense countries. Similarly, there's huge variation in urbanisation rates. New Zealand's about 87%, about the same as Scandinavia, in UK, France, Spain. We're much more urban than any of those. We're not as urban as the Dutch or the Belgians, but much more so than in the Balkans and in Russia. I've always wanted to be a weather forecaster, and I'm going to move my screen over here. And so similarly in terms of wealth, we're about as rich as the Brits and the French. We're less rich than the Swiss. Everyone's less rich than the Swiss, but we've got more money than the Greeks. And so if you put this all together, what we have, let's see if this will work. Here, this is better. Yeah, what we have here is a population density where New Zealand is it's got most in common with the Scandinavian countries in Northern Europe in terms of density. And then in terms of urbanisation, we have similar rates to Scandinavia again. And so let's just narrow our little European twinning exercise down to Norway, Sweden and Finland. And then in terms of income per capita, we're not as rich as the Norwegians, they've got all the cash. We're more in Sweden and Finland's camp, particularly Finland, which is our nearest European twin. The difference is that we have much, much nicer weather than the Finns do. And so this is all jolly interesting because the point is that there are a lot of commonalities between a lot of countries in Europe with New Zealand in terms of geography, economics, demographics, and so forth. And you might say, well, this is all a very nice little geography lesson, but why is it relevant to us here in Nelson today? Well, I mean, it's the basic point is that, yeah, we have the same problems to solve that other countries do, and New Zealand has some spectacularly unflattering statistics. We're the only rich country where road accident deaths are going up. What an achievement. We've also got very lousy productivity, expensive housing, one of the highest rates of obesity and diabetes in the world. The Helen Clark Foundation a couple of years ago produced this report. I recommend it to everyone, the Fair Path, saying that transport policy and investment will need to focus on two things. Firstly, on making the transport system work better for those who are disadvantaged, and secondly, reducing collective dependence on cars as the main form of transport. And the rest of this talk is going to focus very much on the public and active modes, mainly because these are the people-friendly transport modes. And I really like this quote from Jan Gell, about hard to read from the back. He says, being sweet to the pedestrian and the cyclist, you hit 5 birds with one stone. You get a lively, attractive, safe city, sustainable city that's good for your health. And that's fantastic. You just make life easier for these people, you get these outcomes. I mean, think of the opposite. You get a dull, unattractive, unsafe city, unsustainable, that's bad for your health. Yes. That's what you do if you prioritise the opposite. And does anybody recognise this city? Where do we think this is?
It's Amsterdam.
It is Amsterdam, yes. Well done, because yes, as we all know, Dutch cities were clogged with traffic in the 60s because the Dutch went mad for cars in the 60s, same as everyone. So what do we think that the Amsterdam City Council did when faced with a serious amount of clogging? what they did was they went and said, well, we need to obviously unclog the traffic. This is the urban motorway system that we need in Amsterdam. And this was, this particular scheme wasn't built, but a lot of models were made. This is a typical suburban neighbourhood in Amsterdam, and this is how it was going to look in the 60s based upon traffic projections. And this is just a model. This never actually happened, but down the road in Utrecht, they did replace the central canal with a depressed underpass to allow the traffic to flow. And it basically formed this enormous gash right through the centre of the city. Now, this has now been changed, and they decided to give the space back to the city a few years ago, and it now looks like this. They reinstated the canal, there are trees, there are footways. It looks lovely already. It'll be even lovelier as the trees grow back. And I mean, it's one of the loveliest parts of Utrecht, and it shows that what you can really do as soon as you think about your city as a vessel for doing other things than optimizing traffic engineering models. And we've seen this in New Zealand already. If you go to Taupo and look at the old State Highway 1 along the lakefront, that has been turned into this rather gorgeous square that attracts people and works in beautiful complementarity with the lake and with the restaurants that overlook it. And so good transport planning is pretty transferable. The geometry of people, the geometry of vehicles is pretty much the same in any jurisdiction. So let's leave Central North Ireland for a moment. Let's go back to France. I'm a huge Francophile, and France is jolly interesting because in the 60s in France, the French had this economic miracle, the 30 glorious years after World War II, and they went mad for cars and jets and expressways and all this cool stuff, and anything quaint and old like tramways was pretty old chapeau. So I mentioned earlier, almost every French city had tramways up until the 30s. By 1980, only 3 remained: Lille, Saint-Étienne and Marseille, and they were pretty shonky little systems. But in the 1980s, a French Revolution began when Nantes in western France built their first modern tramway, and Grenoble down in the Alps built one as well. And these were quite successful at moving people and helping the city to work better. So other cities, Paris, Strasbourg and Rouen, decided to build some tramways as well in the early to mid 90s, and these worked really well. And then other French cities started getting in on the tramway game. So we had trams in Montpellier, Orléans, Lyon, Nancy, Bordeaux, Clermont-Ferrand, Mulhouse, Valenciennes, Le Mans, Marseille, Nice. All of these were built in the 2000s. And then some more French cities said, well, let's have some more tramways as well. And this included Toulouse, Angers, Reims, Brest, Dijon, Le Havre, Tours, Besançon, Avignon. I think there's one opening Caen, Annecy, I think opens this year, and these are all over France now, as you see by the coloured dots. And the French have really worked out the way to do it, which is basically a question of having dedicated rights of way for your light rail, having modern, really quite attractive vehicles, and also, and this is I think really significant, really making the streetscape pretty as well as just building the infrastructure so that it's joyful to get off and walk around. And you might say, well, this is all trade clever, but isn't it trade expensive? Well, obviously things cost money. And the French have a wonderful little system called the versement transport, which basically is a payroll tax of about 1%, which has to go directly to public transport, and most French cities have it. And that gives you a very, very assured source of funding. And it's much more efficient than having to do endless business cases for your business case, which I'm sure all of us have encountered in one way or another. And it means that transport planners can actually focus on transport planning rather than trying to jump through hoops from the government money pot. And it works really well. This is Marseille. It's the metro and tram map of Marseille in south of France, third largest city in France, and 87% of the people in Marseille can get to the city centre in 30 minutes by public transport. And just the agglomeration benefits of this are incredible. But also, as well as the agglomeration benefits, you just have the social benefits that come when anybody can get where they want to be. So let's go away from Marseille, let's go to Bordeaux. in southwest France, centre of wine country. This is a nice aerial photograph of Bordeaux, and this is the Bordeaux tramway map. There are 4 tramway lines in Bordeaux, all open since 2003. They're all different shades of red. This is Bordeaux. Everything comes back to wine in Bordeaux, including your metro mapping. And this system was introduced by a conservative mayor in Bordeaux who was seeking to improve the city's economy, bring more people in, make it more attractive when you're there, make it more reasons to be there. The tramway was very much part of it, front and centre. And think about what I mentioned earlier about the streetscape enhancement. This is just a square in Bordeaux city centre. You've got modern, very attractive vehicles, nice big windows so you can enjoy what is a beautiful city. And you have just very discreet tracks running through your city centre, meaning that it's a pleasure to walk through this area, and 200 people can come in on every vehicle, and it's like a fountain of pedestrians pouring people into the streets. And also, just to make quite sure the streets work, they have rising bollards to stop anyone from parking anywhere, but to allow deliveries and rubbish trucks in as well. And changing trams in Bordeaux, this is, believe it or not, a transport interchange, but it's a case of crossing a tree-lined square from one beautiful tram to another beautiful tram. It's an absolute pleasure to use, it's joyful to use, it works extraordinarily well, and it's very much part of the streetscape and cityscape. And you see the same elsewhere in France, like Paris, for example. This is the T3 tramway. It's one of the busiest tramways in all of Paris, in all of France, and it's replaced the centre reservation of one of the ring roads around Paris. And so it looks like this. You can see it going under an underpass under a railway line. It looks like this now, but in 2008 it looked like this. This is very much about reassigning the road space to serve the city better. And just keep an eye on that little bit of sky there, and see what happens when the tramway goes in. You have office blocks being built there.
You lower the laptop.
Oh,
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. As long as you aren't asking questions, that's fine. And that's even better. Yeah, maybe yes. Okay, so the point is that by making the street easier to get to and nicer when you're there, you encourage commercial development or office blocks or whatever those buildings are. I don't actually know what they do. But also, it means that the street is more pleasant to be on, it's safer. When I was in Paris last year, it enabled me to cycle to the Eiffel Tower with my friend's son and my friend. The guy is 4, but when you reassign traffic space accordingly, this is what you get. And is that not just wonderful? We want to go to one last French city, which is Brest, which is in northwest France, much smaller city, 139,000, and it's about the same size as Tauranga. But unlike Tauranga, Brest has a light rail system that goes across its big bridge, and this was built a few years ago, and again, this was about urban transformation. This is how the streets looked. I mean, this was an area that was looking in need of transformation, but the space on the road was reassigned from general traffic to be pedestrian friendly. You've got trees, you've got bollards to make sure people don't use it for free parking. I mean, anybody who says that parking anywhere on a footway is a Kiwi phenomenon, you've not been to France. The French love parking anywhere. So you have to make sure you've got les bollards. Now, the point I'm trying to make about this is a huge amount of urban planning is about geometry, about how much space different things take up. And light rail and pedestrianisation is so interesting because you can bring so many people in and people can move around so much more easily if you're not having to maintain general traffic throughput. And so humans, I'm really keen to emphasise, are quite compact. There's about 30 of us in this room. Imagine if there were 30 cars parked in here, you'd never get anywhere. Humans are very, very compact. So this chart here emphasises the compactness. The little bar at the bottom, that represents the space occupied by one person who's walked somewhere. And if a person came by public transport and got off and walked, they're still taking the same amount of space. If somebody comes by bicycle, maybe they're from Nelson, that takes up a bit more space for moving because a bicycle takes up more space than a person on foot. And this little light yellow bit where you need a tiny bit of space to park. And biking is all very well and good. And then it's when you get into the car mode, you need a lot more space for moving and a lot more space for parking. And this is just for like on-street car parking. as soon as you get into sort of assigned parking spaces that are dedicated for one use, the space requirements become absolutely horrendous, and you need 90 times as much space to move and park one person coming by car with their own parking space compared to the 90 that could come if you use the space efficient modes. And this has huge impacts on the kinds of streets and city that you can build. If you are assuming this amount of space per person, you're going to get a city that's spread out like margarine when you're using the very last bit of the pot to spread your toast. And as an example, here is Nelson, which actually has pretty generous amounts of parking, and this is Richmond, which is, yeah, the parking absolutely dominates. And I think what's significant here is that Nelson is actually quite good at using its parking for other things. There's about 300 spaces in this parking lot here, but the busiest day for Nelson for retail is when none of that parking is available, when it's market day. Yeah, footfall goes up by 20%, it's by far the busiest day, even though you can't park there, because people go where there are other people. They go to the market because it's attractive, they go there because different stalls, there's a great atmosphere, there's a good vibe. It's not parking that attracts people, it is attractiveness of this built environment that attracts people. And that comes with accessibility. And I want to pop over to Australia for a second just to illustrate a couple more examples. So let's go to Sydney. So this is George Street in Sydney. So obviously I'm a big fan of George Street. And George Street used to look like this, and now it looks like this. It's been completely reprofiled curb to accommodate a light rail system that moves many, many more people to and through the street. Again, you've got enormous windows there so that the passengers on it can see what's happening nearby. Ooh, I fancy a donut, I'll get off at the next stop, that kind of thing. And while it's extraordinarily expensive and difficult to transform a street from this to this, it has worked as a piece of transport infrastructure. It has worked in terms of, I think, $26 billion worth of real estate investment were catalysed by the transformation of George Street in Sydney. But I'm sure you're thinking, Sydney's got as many people as all of New Zealand, it's hardly relevant. Let's go somewhere smaller. So let's go up the road to Newcastle, which is about 2 hours up the road from Sydney. It's a bit like a sort of Australian scale Nelson. You've got a port, you've got a beach, it's all very lovely. And in Newcastle, the main road, you've got the town centre here, you've got the river here. The main road, Hunter Street, used to look very much like this. And Hunter Street now looks like this. Again, many more people can get there. It's easier to get along the road. It's easier to get across the road. And you've got this direct connection from the town centre to the beach that never had previously. I mean, here's another example on that same street. Getting from town to the beach used to involve kind of crossing 4 lanes, up and over this awful bridge, up, over, down. I mean, it doesn't really invite you to go there, does it? And that's even before you've got to think about carrying small children or taking your grandmother or shopping or whatever. And now it looks like this. It's completely straight across, completely level. You would go to the beach without even really thinking about things because people do what's easiest in the same way that water flows downhill. I mean, this is Australia, right? But I mean, it looks almost Dutch. So let's look at a Dutch street. This is a Dutch street. And isn't it a beautiful Dutch street? We've got kids on bikes, we've got cargo bikes, we've got brick paving, we've got trees, everything Dutch you could possibly imagine, so wholesome. But here's the funny thing, it's not Dutch, it's British. This is Waltham Forest Mini Holland. And this is an exercise that was started in London about 10 years ago, and it was consisted of a large amount of money invested in 3 different outer London boroughs to see if you could use Dutch street techniques to deliver Dutch travel patterns. And Dutch street techniques were basically filtering in residential streets to prevent through traffic, but to enable people to walk and to bike, and on the main roads, streetscape enhancements and protected cycleways. And to give an example, the first street to get the Mini Holland treatment was this little street called Orford Road, which used to look like this in about 2015, and now Orford Road looks like this. It's better for the people who run the pub, it's better for the people who run the cafes, it's better for the people walking through the street, it's better for the bloke with the dog, better for the dog. It's just, what's interesting about Orford Road is for the first time since this happened, all the shops on Orford Road are let. Previously, there were always 1 or 2 vacancies, like a sailor's grin, and now it's completely full up. And similarly, here's the square nearby, just up from that street. And it used to look like this until a few years ago, and it was traffic calmed, a one-way street and some trees. It's all quite nice. But now it looks like this. There are no cars at all. There are new silver birch trees going in. It's been paved with gravel. You can see that there's people sitting there, including the lady in a wheelchair. This is just a much more friendly people street because it's no longer having to fulfill a traffic movement function. It can do so much more. And this attracts people. And you know what attracts more people? More people. And so it continues. There's also a large amount of intermodality. There's good cycle parking, secure, sheltered at the main railway stations. And all of this has resulted in changes in transport. People were cycling more, 9 minutes more per week on average. But what really interesting for me is they were walking 32 minutes more. So this is not really a cycling scheme, it's a livable street scheme. And a person walking half an hour more per person per week, that is like the magic bullet for good health. Our bodies are designed to be active. And the only thing that makes people get enough exercise is if it's worth leaving your front door to be somewhere. And that is what happens if you design streets to do that. So did Dutch street design deliver Dutch travel behaviour outcomes in Walthamstow? It really had. This has been very carefully studied. But please do not think this was innate or that this was going to happen easily. It was very controversial. When Orford Road, the first street that I showed you, when that opened, the mayor of the borough was greeted by an angry mob holding a coffin because they wanted to proclaim the death of the high street. They had taken away the cars and the parking. Waltham Village is going to die. We're not Holland. This will not possibly work. We've got different DNA. I mentioned earlier that the street's very attractive and all the shop units are full and it works. So this was proven not to be correct. But then other boroughs in London proposed similar measures, and they said, well, we're not Waltham Forest, we're Hackney. We're the next borough along, but we're completely different. Yeah. We've got different DNA. We're not like the people in Waltham Forest. And then Hackney made lots of changes. Other cities in the UK proposed similar schemes, and people who didn't like it said, well, we're not London, we're different. We've got very different DNA to London. They're different. Cycling's in their culture. And it's continued over and over again. And it got down to a pretty granular level. This is Mark House Road, which is the main north-south road on the west of Waltham Forest. And this area in green got, again, the mini Holland treatment, the filtered permeability, the cycleways and so forth, the little pocket parks. And then that all worked. And they said, well, okay, let's try it on the other side. And there were people who didn't like it because they said, no, we're from this side of Mark House Road. We're different. They've got different DNA to us. They've got a different culture. It's not going to work. And yeah, literally, we are totally different from that area 200 metres away. This is all pretty homogeneous late 19th century Victorian suburbia, but we're totally different. That's the nature. It's the nature of humans to resist change. It's a survival mechanism, but it does lead to these kinds of reactions. But I mean, it has continued. This is Low Hill Lane, which used to look like this until recently. It now has a traffic filter which has been put in. These are going to be tree pits. There'll be trees here soon. You can still walk through there. You can still ride a bicycle through there. You can't drive through there anymore. And it used to look like this from a different angle, and now it works much better for the ladies with their prams and their kids. It works well for the kids walking home from school, the other person with a little toddler on the trundle wagon. It's all about how do you prioritise streets for people when you don't have to maintain a traffic movement function. And basically the rule is you can prioritise for traffic movement or you can prioritise for life. The choice is up to the road controlling authority. And I mean, as well as working for kids going home from school, I mean, most children will say they would like to cycle home from school. It also opened, by making the streets better, it opened up new cycling markets that hadn't existed previously. There's a wonderful advocacy group called Cycle Sisters, which is Muslim women helping other Muslim women to cycle, because there wasn't a tradition of cycling among the Muslim community in East London, but by being a supportive peer-led group, they were able to say, look, all of these street changes have been made. It's now easy to cycle, it's safe to cycle, and it's been a roaring success. And I really recommend looking them up. They're a wonderful, wonderful group of ladies. And it's not just for the bikes and the pedestrians. It also works for people on the mobility devices. Here's a lady on what used to be a 4-lane road. Now she's able to drive along in a little scooter down what was one of the main roads in Waltham Forest, but it's been reprofiled to be better for cycling as well as walking and as well as public transport. Basically, it's a much more inclusive approach to street design. And this reminded me of a photograph that I saw from the Netherlands. I mean, the Dutch people love going out on their mobility scooters. You get whole gangs of scooter people going out on little trips into the Dutch countryside to sort of hang out with one another and, I don't know, pick tulips. And which is fun, but also it has a real inclusivity aspect as well. I love this quote from the guy who took this photograph. He says, "When my father lost the ability to cycle, he switched to a mobility scooter to get wherever he wanted to or needed to be. He was able to continue his voluntary work in Utrecht Cathedral. Because of the scooter and because of the cycling infrastructure, he was able to continue to make all sorts of journeys by himself for almost 10 extra years." So I think that's absolutely wonderful. And you think about Nelson, how I think a third of the population is going to be over 65 within the next decade. Think about the number of people that are going to be wanting to have freedom of the city, but necessarily not wanting to drive. Think about that and inclusivity. And there's a really interesting side hustle into that, just in relation to the number of devices that can use good cycling infrastructure. Like, as well as bikes, you've got trikes and mobility scooters, the e-hand cycles, segways, tandems. Seriously, blind people love going cycling, and tandems are the way to do it. Also other devices that are emerging. I mean, what with the growth in battery and motor technology, everyone's looking at electric cars, but really these are much, much more exciting, and they're much more efficient because all of these devices weigh less than the person using them. So I'm going to finish with some quotes, and let's see, does anybody know this one? The city is grand because it grants everyone the opportunity to make the most of themselves. Anyone know who came up with this one? Do we think it was Jacinda Ardern, or do we think it was Michael Bloomberg or Winston Peters? Who do you reckon said this? Well, based upon this deafening shout out, I'm going to help. I'll give you a clue though, it's Greek. And it's actually a very old quote. It's from Pericles, who was the ruler of Athens 2,500 years ago, when Athens was at its grandest and most important. The city grants everyone the opportunity to make the most of themselves. And I think that's a really important aspect as far as city planning is concerned, make it actually work for more people. Because this is my second point, and yeah, you get the name with this one, William White. What attracts people most, it would appear, is other people. And this is a man that founded the Project for Public Spaces. His work was started in New York, but this was based upon a very empirical study that people go where there are other people, particularly if you're sitting down somewhere to have a sandwich. You don't sit down in a deserted square. You sit down where there's other people who are around, because that feels safer. And so city streets that appeal to people are the ones to do. And I mean, this is difficult. It's all very difficult to say, well, our streets aren't attractive, we don't know what to do. But I would like to put you in touch with Thomas Barta, the shoe magnate, who said, don't say it cannot be done, rather say you don't know how to do it yet. There's always a way to find out. And it's always very easy to want to stay in our own jail and just say, I'm stuck. But really, there's always a way forwards, and we owe it to ourselves to create the best Nelson that we can. I mean, Nelson's got such terrific bones, it's got great climate, it's got great culture. What can we do to really make Nelson thrive? And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Hello.
Hi, I've just recently moved from Wellington, where I'm not sure about Nelson yet, but where we seem to be involved in endless consultations. So you have a consultation, particularly Lambton Key. You have a consultation, they produce a lovely graph, and then they give the results of the consultation. Then you have to do a consultation on the results of the consultation, and I'm pretty sure there's been a third one. So after 10 years of consultation, I think they've started digging up a bit of the ground. So I'm interested. I've also been to Dijon, and several of those French cities. How did they get round? Did they not bother consulting, since France is supposed to be terribly democratic? I mean, how did they get round all this?
I think the Bordeaux one is one I know best. A large amount of it was business led. It was this mayor who he basically sort of said, I want a city that's better for business. I want people to be attracted to it. And it was very much saying this, what can we do to make this actually happen? I think a huge amount helps is the way the local government works in France, being able to have your little payroll tax. That makes it so much easier. Consultation goes round in circles in New Zealand because the money is so hard to get hold of. So often you will consult and then no money was available to build it, so you have to consult again because the plans have got dusty, and so on and so forth. So having assured funding is a huge big deal. And I mean, the French systems would have been done based upon extensive engagement, but also it was very much about the mayor having a vision and having the ability to get people on board with it and say, if we do this, then we'll have a city that more people want to visit, and it will be nicer to be in, and more people want to study here, and so on and so on and so on. So yeah, political bravery and assured funding are the two things that are required.
If you go back for a second to Waltham Forest, the time when they were bringing up the coffin, trying to stop it.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of what the dynamics were at that time that stopped that kind of protest from actually succeeding?
I think data was a huge big deal. There were lots of studies about surveys of businesses in the original village of how do you think people will get to your business, and 99% said, well, of course they drive and park outside, obviously. And actually it was much more like, I think about 50% of the trips were walking, walk all the way. A lot of them were public transport. So being able to actually say, well, yes, you've got your coffin, but that's actually not how people are getting here at the moment. And that was before this change is really bedded in. That was a huge big deal. There was one shop on this street that was still furious. I remember taking a study tour around there in 2016. It was an antique shop, and the man came running out, sort of brandishing a stick like a Dickensian cantankerous gentleman. And but he was just more fundamentally dogmatic, I think. But yeah, there's a Michael Bloomberg quote, "In God we trust, everyone else bring data," and I think that was a huge part of it. Also, I mean, I must emphasise political bravery. This guy, Clyde Lokes, was absolutely fundamental. He was the deputy mayor for transport in the area, and he would have copped so much abuse from horrible basement warriors sort of sitting in their mum's basement going, ah, and wanting to derail it because he's clearly part of Agenda 21 or so forth.
Yeah.
And being able to actually have the courage of your conviction to carry on and make it happen. It helped that it was not a swing seat. There was one party that's very much in charge. So they said, okay, well, if we lose 10% of the vote, that's fine, we'll still get returned. What's interesting is that people have stood against this kind of thing, saying, vote for me and I'll repeal Mini Holland. They never get in. Because people really like safer streets that are repealing. I mean, for most people who just are wanting to get on with their lives, I mean, you get a bit of hot heat in the press, but most people just get on with things because humans are extraordinarily adaptable, and when they see that they can let their kids cycle to school independently, and when they aren't having traffic driving past their houses, they think, well, actually, this is quite nice, you know. And yeah, seeing is really believing, and the We're Not Holland objections very much, well, you've not gone there and seen it for yourself, but I mean, once you've actually experienced it, I mean, like most people, picking up on the consultation point earlier, do not have the time to sit around and read plans and imagine them in 3 dimensions in their head with people walking around there. You know, they've got actual life. And so it's wonderful to actually be able to demonstrate it properly and say, look, yeah, here's how it works. And I think you cannot please all the people all the time, but for most people it was very much, well, this actually does work, and the fact that it was not the vote loser that pundits were predicting. I mean, if you based political decisions based upon people's Facebook comments, you're never going to get anything terribly effective. So that's a rather long answer.
Given that, you know, I think we've faced similar objections in this region to anything. Any urban design discussion inevitably comes down to parking. Is there value, do you think, in trying to change people's minds about that? Like, is it worthwhile trying to engage with that process to try and change the public narrative? Or is it more effective simply just to do it and have the results speak for themselves?
It's worth having the data so that you can say, because if you were to go and say, well, they changed the parking in Mount Maunganui and it was fine, they'll say, well, we're not Mount Maunganui, we're different. So you've got to actually understand, the sense of the surveys, how people are getting there compared to how the businesses think they're getting there. That's the big one. Also to understand how people are using the spaces. I mean, quite often you'll say, a business says, I need the parking space for my customers. Really, they just park in front of the shop all day, or their staff park in front of the shop all day. You don't need to do that. So yeah, understanding is good. And being able to build trust, I think, is significant, because, I mean, we had this a lot in Auckland when we redesigned bits of High Street. The shopkeepers weren't that concerned about loss of car parking. It was more, what we don't want is, basically our businesses rely on footfall. A year's worth of construction disruption is going to affect my bottom line. And I mean, if you're running a business, you've got staff to worry about, you've got customers to worry about, suppliers, invoices, all the rest. You've got quite a lot on your plate. And the last thing you want is some guy from the council saying, oh, by the way, we didn't tell you, but we're taking your parking away, because that's one extra thing to worry about, and they do not like it. You're interfering with the model. So it's very much work with people and inform them. I think, in Auckland, the best one is Karangahape Road Business Association. They previously worked very well with Auckland Transport. Then Auckland Transport disbanded that part of the business, and they haven't worked so well since. But the Business Association have been absolutely instrumental, actually, understanding this parking equation. Yeah, again, you can't please all the people all the time, but do understand it. Yeah. But parking management is fascinating, because you can manage parking as part of the intended outcome, and the psychology of car parking is. I could talk about car parking all night, but buy me a beer and I will.
Just looking at the pictures that you've shown, I got the sense that there were large numbers of different technologies, or at least large numbers of different designs of trams in different places. And I'm kind of wondering how many times the same kind of thing was done in multiple places, and how many times different designs, like I think Hovenring or something like that, that showed up in one of the other pictures, where you had some people who were basically aerial on a suspended platform.
The people on the scooters, yes.
How many different kind of restarts of the same thing have been tried in many different places, and how many times is this largely a carbon copy of the same kind of approach?
Well, the ring is in Eindhoven. It's a really interesting structure, but a large amount, 99% of Dutch cycling infrastructure is not sexy suspended rings. It's mostly pretty basic highways engineering for bicycles done well along pretty established lines. That's a showcase piece on the main road into Eindhoven. But in terms of carbon copies, the best one I can think of is Australia. So I mentioned those 29 French cities that have built light rail, and you might say, basically, the French, there are two, it's a duopoly of suppliers of the tracks and technology, and between them they've got the French market sewn up. And the styling may be different of the vehicles, but they basically work identically. They've all got stop spacing of about 500 meters, normally wires above, but some of them work with a third rail system down the centre, which makes for a nicer streetscape, and all of them have similar sort of low floor vehicles and so on. And you might say, well, this is very French, it wouldn't work here. But the Australian trams I mentioned in Gold Coast, Newcastle, Sydney, in Brisbane, not Brisbane, Canberra, all of them are using the exact same principles as in France. You still got the 500 metre stop spacing, the long, low vehicles, the better streetscape. Australian tramways are a carbon copy of French ones, and I think the Sydney one, the Sydney main line down George Street was taking, I think it took 80 million passengers last year, something incredible. Yeah. It's extraordinarily successful, and it's not because this is their French way of doing things, it's because geometrically, in terms of transport planning, this is a good way of doing anything. You can try and reinvent good ideas. You might say, well, this is a bit old hat, why can't we have a blockchain-powered Hyperloop with individual self-driving Tesla trucks? But don't bother, just do what works. buy it off the counter and use it. It's like, I've got a glass of water, it's very nice. I could try and have a different shaped vessel that delivers me a refreshing drink in a different way, but I'd rather stick with a glass that's been proven to work. And with transport technology, buying the proven version is almost always the best one to do.
I'm just interested, I mean, with your examples in France and stuff, were there communities of a similar size, 40, 50,000 people, where the installation of a rail network proved economic and proved viable and all those sorts of things? I mean, it seems to be a function of size to a degree.
To a degree, yes. I think the smallest one's about 100,000, which is basically if you add Nelson and Richmond together and boil them in a pot for 20 years of population growth. So
And over a similar sort of a geographic area?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, we are, in terms of French comparators, we are at the small end, but I mean, I think it's what's the way that transport evaluation takes place in this country and in the UK and others is very much about travel time savings. But really with something like this, as soon as the real value doesn't come from the fact that it's quick, even though it is, but in terms of the development that it stimulates. I mean, I mentioned in Sydney, $26 billion worth of development because it's more accessible and pleasanter. I mean, I doubt you would get $26 billion worth of development in Newcastle, New South Wales, but nonetheless, the basic mathematics hold true.
Any, as you've traveled around New Zealand a little bit, have you seen any provincial towns that you think, oh, they're making the right steps?
Wanganui is very good. I think they've done a real good job in terms of their public transport system and enhancing public realm in the centre. Because that's basically, is it easy to get to? Yes. Is it nice when you're there? Yes. Yeah. And I think that they've not spent a great deal of money. It's not sort of been cataclysmic money, but they spent money well on having a well-connected bus system, which they didn't have for years, and also making use of the heritage buildings. And I mean, I think per capita it must be one of the most heritage-rich places in the country. It's wonderful.
When the new museum opens too, I think it'll help.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, so you've shown us what a good job looks like, and greater minds than mine probably look at that and go, great, let's do that. Why are we tripling down on a model that all the experts tell us is at scale, not possible to deliver, but we seem to be holding on to it until the very dying? Why do the people in power not change? What's the driver? Is there a massive car lobby that we are underestimating the power of? Are we?
It's a big deal.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It really is. I mean, the amount of money. I think car advertising is the biggest or second biggest category of advertising in the country. Think of, if you open the newspaper or watch TV, the amount of buy more cars. Sorry, buy more utes. Buy the Mitsubishi Beast. Be manly. It's all over the shop. They are massive spenders, and that does shape the discourse to a huge extent.
Right.
And the vested interest, lack of imagination, and also a lack of effective mechanisms to deliver better outcomes quicker. And the hand up in the bag.
Just to answer your question, we've got the second highest car ownership per head of population in the OECD. It might be the world. Yeah. So that's part of the problem, is that we just have huge ownership of private vehicles, and people just want to be able to park outside their house or wherever they feel like it, basically.
Yeah.
So, whereas I lived in Bristol too, and 25% of people in Bristol don't own a car. So, there's a lot more people cycling and stuff and using public transport, although they still don't have a light rail, I believe.
Oh, Bristol Light Rail will be going to a frozen hell, I think. It's not happening just yet. But yeah, but this is why I like to cite the Australian examples, because Australian car ownership, while not at New Zealand levels, is pretty high. Look.
I really liked your point about e-bikes or e-transportation in general, small e-transportation, because I think, at least in Nelson, we've seen a great increase in the number of people and older people who are riding e-bikes and a few trikes around. So I think they're, especially in that kind of 65 to 75 range, there's a great opportunity that is kind of emerging as without much help, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I mean, yeah, people do what's easiest, and if you're able to get a bike that does half the work for you, that's easy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I mean, I
Well,
don't.
if it's windy out, there's all sorts of barriers for people getting on their bike. Whereas that kind of reduces the barriers right there.
Yes.
So do you see that as being, I don't know, it seems to me we've seen a really, anecdotally anyway, it appears that we've seen a great increase and that they've really taken a big market share and increased market share.
Yes, they have. I mean, I think there are more electric bikes sold worldwide than electric cars, and I think what's also interesting is that it's the scooters, the sort of stand-up scooters. That's a massive market as well, and I mean that's absolutely ballooned, and nobody expected it. But again, that's catering for the same sort of market of sort of cycling level distances. Maybe they want to ride a bike, but the scooter will do the job nicely, and you get lots of people who use them as mobility aids. Because here's the thing. Traditionally, being disabled has meant buying specialised kit like this, which is awesome. It's like that's like a sit-down Segway. They're awesome. But they cost about $30,000. Whereas, if you have a mobility impairment or something else, which means walking is difficult, you can go down to Noel Leeming, buy yourself a kick scooter for $1,000, which will, if you are able to use it, will have that freeing effect, leaving you 29 grand to spend on beer.
Hey George, I'm just looking at the mobility scooter shot on the top there. How easy is it to change our road codes and things where micromobility and other types of things can actually use that type of infrastructure? So right now I think only bikes can go into a cycle lane. Is there ways that all these other groups can be part of that too, so that we can open that up?
Yes, it can be done. It's always often difficult. It takes ages to change rules. But I mean, rules are made by humans. We can change them. The main thing is to have sensible conversations and agree at a consensus.
But that's central government level, right?
Yes.
That's not local government.
As far as I know, yes. I mean, I don't know if Nelson would want to introduce a bylaw of we're Nelson and you may use your mobility scooter on a bikeway, because that'd be pretty cool. I mean, again, if Nelson wanted to pitch itself to even more retirees, very much, come here, you will always have freedom of movement. I mean, well, how cool is that? You will never be marooned in Nelson.
Yeah, I think some of that infrastructure is safe. A lot of it would probably be a bit daunting for somebody in a trike or something.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
No, an electric trike.
Maybe not. Yeah.
Yes,
Sure.
interesting comment for you. In terms of practicality and engineering wise, I gather you've been promoting light rail primarily here tonight. How would you see that being developed here in view of our topography
Nelson?
and landscape generally?
I don't know Nelson as well as anybody in this room, so I cannot give you a consultant's answer. But I mean, the basic characteristics I would say is that Nelson and Richmond are an extraordinarily linear settlement, and linear settlements are the best for public transport because you have, you can do it all with one line, or a lot of it with one line. The best comparison I know of that is Gold Coast light rail in Australia. But obviously, Gold Coast is a much more intense environment than here. We don't have meter maids in Nelson. But yeah, that works because it's basically a very long coastal strip, and you've got stop every 500 meters.
Flat.
And in terms of topography, well, you tell me, it looked like a very flat drive from Richmond to here.
Sorry.
It looked like a flat drive from Richmond to here. Obviously, you cannot go everywhere by every mode, but nonetheless, it is pretty flat outside. I believe it's pretty flat in the rest of Nelson. It's pretty flat in Richmond. Is all of it flat? No, of course not. You can't do one thing with everything. But to say, I mean, to say that, okay, obviously the French only have light rail because it's always flat everywhere in France, well, that's obviously nonsense. Understand what will work, and it's the hand behind.
It's just, can you comment on the Auckland example of light rail, which seems to have been a complete disaster? And was it partly because the traffic planners were not prepared to give up road space, and hence the cost of going underground somewhat torpedoed it? What are your thoughts on What
Yes, that was a part of it. All of the examples I've shown from Australia and from France of light rail specifically reassigned road space from general traffic to light rail, which moves many more people, and it's nicer when you're there. But it does require a willingness to actually engage with people along the route and say, we're going to do that. And that was not, the willingness was not there sufficiently in Auckland. And then also somebody came along and said, well, we'll give you free money to do it a different way, and the decision was taken. I mean, Auckland, to pick up on your point about topography, sir, yeah, that was forecast to go up Queen Street Valley, which is not flat. It's
very steep.
Indeed it is, and it's been climbed by light rail vehicles in 1902. It could do so yet again.
Yeah.
And that would have been utterly transformative for Auckland Central Isthmus. I think what's significant about that is that the light rail in Dominion Road was very much about enhancing public transport capacity. If you want to move more people, you need bigger vehicles. Dominion Road is basically doing about as much as it can with double-decker buses. If you want to move more people, you need a bigger vehicle than a double-decker bus. Triple-decker buses are not on the market, so you've got to think about what will move more people, and a light rail vehicle will do that, and let's see what happens, because the geometry of people per hour does not change.
So what you talked about light rail, which means you have to spend an awful lot of money putting rails in the road. What about other forms of mass rapid transit? I've been to Bogota and Lima, and they've both got basically exclusive bus lanes, which are kind of like light rail, except you don't have to put highly expensive rails in the road. And they both, well, Bogota's got 9 million people, and it seemed to move an awful lot of people. So what about that? And that's a lot less expensive to put in and more flexible if you have to change.
It's actually planned in Nelson for priority lanes for buses.
Yeah, well, that would be the first thing to
Yes,
do.
I mean, a priority lane is different to a full busway, but yes, I mean,
Yes.
Auckland's had that for years. The Auckland Northern Busway opened in 2008. I mean, there was a large amount of scepticism that would ever work because buses aren't in North Shore DNA. We have cars in our DNA. As it is, half the people crossing Auckland Harbour Bridge in the morning speak are doing so by bus because of the success of the busway. It works extraordinarily well, and like you say, it works because it works. A bus can drive onto it, zoom up the busway, and go off and do whatever it wants in Albany or Browns Bay or wherever. And the Bogota system, again, was extraordinary because I think that was built instead of, they were going to build like a metro line, they had money for 5 stops, but they were able to build 90 kilometres of busway in the late 90s and early 2000s, the trans-millennia. It's pretty awesome. I mean, they have their place. They can be extraordinarily effective. The reason that I've been showing light rail pictures is mainly because they come with the streetscape enhancement. Most of the Bogota Transmillennia, I've not been to it. I'd love to go to Colombia. Most of it is, as far as I can gather, on the side or in the central reservation of motorways and expressways. Rather like the Auckland one.
When you get
So you don't have that same pedestrian enhancement that comes with it as well. I mean, you can do trackless trams if you like. That is basically the same idea as a tram, but without the rail track. The thing about a trackless tram is that a couple of things. Firstly, it requires basically a road to operate on, which will still look and feel like a road. It requires exclusive rights of way, platforms, signalling changes, highway strengthening to support the weight of the vehicle. You're kind of getting towards what you do for an actual tram, so why not just build the actual tram, which can run on a narrower corridor and come with the a better quality of public realm. I mean, they have options. They're trying a trackless tram out in Perth, I think. Let's see how it works and decide if there's something that would work here or not. I think there's not much to be gained from being the first move with public transport innovation. Don't go first, go second and make money from it. That's what Bill Gates said with any of his products, and it's kind of the truth of transport.
I think one of the challenges we face in Nelson, probably this is universal throughout New Zealand, but one of the reasons why cars are such a big part of the conversation is really, it feels like it's how we grow and how we develop. And at the moment, our growth happens to be out Richmond, Waimea Plains and so forth. And because of that growth, it means that all those people need to drive into work. And because of that, we have parking is all everyone talks about because they need to cater for all those people. So therefore, we're not getting the nice space in the town because we have all this car parking And as a result of that, people no longer want to live in this central town, and so therefore they move out past Richmond. We get more and more growth happening in that area. So I guess the question really is, how do you break that cycle of development into one which isn't relying on settlement patterns which are fundamentally only serviced by cars?
Well, fundamentally, yes. If you build nothing, if you make it only legal and profitable to build car-dependent sprawl,
Yes.
developers will build car-dependent sprawl. I mean, developers are not sort of some evil bunch of maniacs with cement in their bloods. They're wanting to make a profit, and if policies and regulations and everything make it so that that is the best commercial option to do with their money, they will do it. I mean, it is not any of their interest whether or not somebody gets stuck in a traffic jam first day leaving their new house or not. They've legged it by that point. Who cares? So really, I mean, I don't know if anyone here is in the policy space, but anything to cease further sprawl onto what is basically the richest agricultural land in the country, and it's disgraceful to abuse it with shopping malls, would be a good start. Nelson has so much space to grow internally. So does Richmond. I mean, Richmond has good bones in its centre. There's no need to keep on spreading out like butter. And so making it more profitable and more legal to build an existing urban area would be the thing to do. Because, I mean, because basically, I mean, it's the digging up fruit groves to build single-storey bungalows. It's an extractive form of land development. It's like mining. You extract the value once, you build your houses, you bugger off. That's it. That's all there is to it. It's not placemaking. It's not creating any long-term value. So don't make it make it illegal. Is what I say.
Because how do you make it more profitable to develop in a city?
Look at the business processes contained within in terms of land prices, taxation, incentives. I mean, I am not a regeneration specialist, plenty of people are and can tell you, but in terms of the relative barriers to developing the centre, I mean, it's more complicated if you're working within the existing urban fabric. And I mean, I can see why, from a developer's perspective, if they're risking their own money, why go to all that trouble when you can just steamroller out more tract housing like toothpaste?
But also this problem seems to be that the cost of land in the city is high. You know, I mean, there's a situation in Christchurch where there's all this land that's available that people, you know, the cost of the land seems to be retained, and all that's being built are luxury townhouses. You know, and so that's the next looming problem on the horizon. But you know, so I'm just interested in your comment about making it more affordable to develop in the inner city, and I'm just interested, you know, how does one reverse that historic trend that the inner city is expensive land?
I cannot give a Nelson specific answer, but I mean, there are ways to do it, and I mean, in terms of local central government can get involved, in terms of enabling development that can support a higher land price. Is another example. Long-term investments. I mean, there are many ways to do it. I can't give a specific answer.
Allowing greater density.
Yes.
I mean, so that, and that I made my first submission to do with the density thing for Nelson, and it just seemed to me that it was a no-brainer to allow more density in the inner city.
Well, not just the inner city, but the donut around that inner city.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
That's been banned. You know, sprawl's been mandated. That's the problem.
I'll tell you one thing that has changed recently in New Zealand, and that's a huge big deal in the right direction. We no longer have minimum car parking requirements.
Yes.
That used to make density extraordinarily expensive, because if every house had to come with 2 parking spaces, that meant that you're using about $100,000 per unit just on the ready car parking. You no longer have that requirement anymore. That makes a lot more feasible, so that should shape what happens. Timo, you're sitting there patiently at the back.
Yes, I would just like to add a little bit to the question of land prices. I think high land prices in themselves are not necessarily a massive problem, because higher land prices actually make you use the land more efficiently. But if you have high land prices and at the same time you don't permit certain build forms that you would require in order to make it stack up, then it starts to become difficult. And if you have that situation, and at the same time you also have a permitted situation where you can just roll out your butter, as you call it, your standalone houses, it's permitted greenfield development. If you're a developer, there's absolutely no incentive to actually carry on with the more difficult process where you actually have to jump through hearings and hoops and consultation for Africa before you can actually build something that would economically work, but because you can't, it won't work economically under those circumstances. So there are quite a few levers that need to be pulled, one of which is the comparative thing, which is the alternative to regeneration, which is basically greenfield. So if you constrain that, then all of a sudden there's much more incentive to build in a regenerative way, and there's also more demand for people to buy it because they start to run out of alternatives.
Yes, basically people do what's easiest. Yes, Anne?
What about civic infrastructure?
So,
how does that, like we had a library project that was parked in the previous local government, but does development come with civic investment? Would that help generate private investment?
do you mean the public sector leading or the public sector?
Well, I'm talking about local government, like say a civic centre library kind of initiative that might or might not happen in the future in the city.
Yes. Sorry, I can't find the question.
No, sorry. Yeah.
I mean, it might be developer contributions in other ways that you can exact things from development to help achieve the public good, I guess. But,
yes. Developer contributions are a valid way to do things, and I mean it works both ways, because if you've got more people living in a centre, then the streets have to work harder, and you need more civic infrastructure. So yes, developer contributions are a very established way of paying for civic infrastructure. Just the main thing is to have a deal that actually is fair and isn't one side extracting the other.
I think in Nelson right now, they tend to waive a lot of DCs just to encourage the development. So it's until you get that kind of momentum of going, it's kind of really hard to utilize or leverage that particular thing.
Yeah.
So it's
Indeed. I mean, just an example, just picking up on Timo's point of a city that had dead land at the centre for decades, even though it was well connected. I mean, different scale, but Toronto waterfront should have been the best bit down by Lake Ontario. It was basically old rail yards under a freeway, and nobody could do anything with it because it was so much easier to keep sprawling out. Mayor, I think Keesnut, brought in a green belt in Toronto, and it was just like squeezing a balloon. All of a sudden, it made sense to develop in the waterfront where it didn't previously, because you could just churn out more McMansions. And so people do what's easiest, so make it easy to do the right thing.
One thing I've thought about, and I don't know if it's very fanciful, but Nelson's sort of flat and it goes sort of steep. So we've got all this fringe sort of area adjacent to the city centre. And I often think that with the new technologies, we've got this mindset you have to drive your car to your house. Well, we know in Wellington and places in Nelson you can't get your car to your house. So I was just thinking a lot of this fringe area that's not good land could be almost in self-sufficient little blocks that you didn't need to drive to. It could be self-sufficient to all services, with their solar and whatnot. And on valley floors have your public motorways, but public buses or whatnot. Has that happened anywhere in the world?
It happened. There are examples of that all over the world. I mean, an example I know of that is the Busan Art Village in South Korea, which is basically based upon small plots
houses,
on
big land,
walkable on the sides of hills, and linked by stairways down to a centre. Now, I mean, this area only ever developed due to the Korean War. Busan's the very, very bottom of South Korea. It was the only bit that was never occupied by the North Korean army in the 50s. So everyone squeezed themselves into Busan, and they built shacks everywhere on the hills, and then these stayed as North Korea was repelled back to the 51st parallel, and they were then rebuilt into the houses. I mean, they would have been pretty basic back in the day, but now it has endured this wonderful ecosystem of basically
arty permaculture throughout Busan, and people go there from all over the world to go and look at it.
I think
And
that'll be really neat for Nelson.
there is a lot to be said about can you develop at a purely walkable scale? I mean, you go to like that photograph I showed of the Italian hill town. Most of that is only accessible on foot. I mean, there's no reason physically why you cannot do it. Legally, I do not know the deets. Maybe you'd have to have all part of one development. Maybe that's how you title it. I don't know. I'm not that kind of planner. But I mean, in terms of saying you can't drive there, so it shouldn't be developed, there's more to it than that. I do not know the specific sites, so I cannot give Nelson specific advice. But I mean, it's think about it. The human settlement for about everything up until the last 200 years was based on can you walk there or not. The idea of having to get your cart there is a fairly recent concept, and we've survived as a species up until then. So we're still the same species.
In terms of what's achievable, I like your idea, but of course it might have a negative effect. In fact, it would on the central city that I think we're supposed to be concentrating on. Is that true? Is that have I misunderstood something here?
I don't know the specific site, so that's difficult to say. I mean, but broadly speaking, you want as many people as possible living within walking distance of your centre. If this is within walking distance, then that's good.
Passing distance, you pop down to your local bus and there you are.
I think a good ideal. But again, I say, what effect would that have on the critical function? And that's the city centre. I was very involved about 35 years ago in creating what you see here now in terms of the trees and the lights and the ring road and the brick paving and all the rest of it. It was a big project. But we got through it in 18 months because we picked up the pick and shovel and got on with the job. Nothing has happened for 30 years. I just throw this in as a vision that might be worth considering. It was an element of that project that got missed out, and that was the joining of both Nile streets by virtue of a tunnel through Cathedral Hill. And then that would have allowed the creation of a plaza from the cathedral, down the steps, across what is known as Selwyn Place, and join up with what has been created of more recent times at the top of what we call Trafalgar Street. That's achievable, and it would certainly take a bit of the traffic away from the prominent part of the city, which I think you would agree is that end of the city, the steps. I see people there by the dozens every day with their cameras, so it must be an attraction. So I just throw that in as a factor that is still worth considering, an alternative to a considerable project to put a tunnel. It's quite a big span there.
Yes.
It could be created in a bendy form under the steps. Okay. So that was also very seriously considered 35 years ago.
That's the story of the paving, because it is rather wonderful. I suppose as far as traffic engineering is concerned, the easiest traffic to manage is the traffic that isn't there. So I mean, I would say before we start digging tunnels, let's think about how to make better use of our existing road space for the transport modes that are more space efficient first. Because in terms of the distance of journeys, the type of journeys, let's think about how to use the space first. Then we can start digging tunnels. Timo, you're standing here like
I am. I just try to, want to point out that poor George has had a bit of a marathon today, and it's I think quite a bit past 6 o'clock, 20 past already. So I just wonder whether we should give him a break and maybe wrap the session up.
Good question, George. Do you think it's generational? Do you think we have the ability with the ageing population to make this